Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 4 to 5 show, the IT Pro edition. And as it is almost getting into that season, or at least at the northern part of the world where everyone will go on vacation, I thought it would be fun to just spend like 30 minutes or so on some resources, some places that I use to learn around identity and to learn about Azure AD. Hey, good afternoon, TRP8472. I'm terrible at names. I think you said your name last week, and I promised myself to write it down, and then I didn't. So excuse me for that. So what I want to do is actually, hi Andy, thanks. What I want to do because a lot of times I get a question from people who wanted to start doing stuff around identity, and they ask me like, how did you learn the stuff you know? How did you learn the identity related stuff? And of course, after that, the Azure AD stuff. And for me personally, my story is probably not going to apply to you. So for me, it's actually a funny story. So I've been in IT and Microsoft products for, let me think, almost 20 years, I think. From a part-time job, being a system administrator at a school, going to being a program manager at Microsoft. And when I started at that school that time ago, you could basically try out every Microsoft product for not that much money. So I did everything. I installed back then they still had NT4. So we did the upgrade to Server 2000, set up Active Directory, Exchange, all that type of stuff. Probably made a lot of mistakes, but learned a lot during that period. And then after I graduated, I basically went to work with a Microsoft partner right away, because I already figured out that Microsoft technology was for me the way to go. And to figure that out, actually during I wrote my thesis at a company that only did Linux, and then hardcore Linux. It took me 2 days to compile OpenOffice back then, to only have a text editor available on my machine. Again, learned a lot. Also learned that Linux is not my cup of tea. Still, I do know some about the system as I work with that. So I went to work for a Microsoft partner because I figured out Microsoft stuff, that's cool. And how I got into identity is actually kind of a funny story, where I told that partner that I do know how to write some code, and I do know stuff about infrastructure. And back then, Microsoft just was about to introduce a product called ILM2, Identity Lifecycle Manager. And what they heard is that for that product, you need to write some code and you need to know about infrastructure. So I just joined the club, and they were like, you told us you can write code and you know something about infrastructure, go learn that product. And that's where my identity journey basically started. From that, from implementing all kinds of ILM slash Forefront Identity Manager, working with Forefront products, but also ADFS and AD and also those type of things. I roll into the identity space. But if I look back right now and I'm like, okay, where should you start if you want to learn around identity? I do think I have a few resources that I stumbled upon in the last few years that could be interesting. And when you're lying down on that nice, cozy chair next to the pool, maybe this is something of your interest to read or to watch. So one thing I like to do when it goes to learning identity stuff is to basically structure it into 4 pillars. So to be honest, this is part of a blog post, which has been a revised version. So let me go one back, which is called the 4 pillars of identity. And basically this blog post, which is pretty old, I can tell you. Let me see, what's the date? January 2013. So we're talking about 8+ years that this is old. And actually my manager and some other people I know worked on this document. But still, as it is kind of high over around how identity should work, a lot of this stuff still applies to today's infrastructures. So I will create a post. I will put it out on Twitter and in the chat with all the links I'm going to discuss today, so you can find them. But you can also use your favorite search engine and just search for the 4 pillars of identity. And what we mean with the 4 pillars of identity is basically what we're saying here, and I'm just going to scroll through a lot of text because this is the core piece here, is that based on what you do with identity, you should always think about administration, authentication, authorization, and auditing. And I know there are also some structures where you have more than 4 pillars, where some pillars are split up. But I like to structure what I'm going to learn about identity. And this is also, for example, when I do a workshop with a customer that wants to learn around identity in general, this is a great way to structure it. To start with administration. What does it mean? Authentication. What does it mean? Authorization and auditing. What does it mean? And that's also where this blog post is about. And also the things you need to think about. When I implement an identity and access management solution, I need to do something with administration. Or maybe you can call it governance, because administration and auditing together can also be seen as governance, right? Administration is around how do I get the users into the system the right way, and how do I get them into other systems? So part of provisioning. And how do I do that with approvals and requests? And then authentication is around, okay, how I got the user in the system, they got a password, or they're using a passwordless credential, but they have some kind of credential. How do they use that to sign in? And then authorization is then the next step. After that authentication, what can they do? What are the rights? What type of model I'm going to use? I'm going to look after a role-based type of system, or am I more the attribute-based access control type of system, type of person? So all those type of things are things to consider when you're thinking and talking about identity and access management. And this also relates back to Azure AD, to the components of Azure AD. If you look at administration, for example, Azure AD Connect is part of administration. Getting the users from on-premises to the cloud is part of the provisioning process and linking those objects there. But also outbound provisioning stuff, for example, to Salesforce. And if you haven't looked into it, we now have a public preview to also provision on-premises SQL systems. So that could also be part of that administration piece. And hello, xgetel0. I hope I'm saying that right. Thanks for joining. So that's there. Authentication is around, like, how do I authenticate? Do I use SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth, those type of things? And this is where I want to pause and jump a little bit into resources to learn around how does authentication works. Because if you look at identity, authentication, of course, all the 4 pillars are equal important, or some are even more important. But authentication is in the end the core, right? I want to sign into something. How do I do that? And then authorization kicks in. So how did I learn about authentication? XA. Oh, okay, cool. How did I learn about authentication? So just by doing, to be honest. What I said, when I was assistant administrator at a school 15 years ago, or 15 plus years ago, I didn't know how Kerberos worked. I didn't know how NTLM works. And I didn't know, like, why NTLM is terrible and why you should never use it, and why you want to use Kerberos and how that flow works. But in the end, you stumble upon things, and you're going to research and deep dive into and learn about those protocols. And one thing I think is very important to point out is that if you know about those on-premises protocols like Kerberos or NTLM, that can be a huge advantage, especially when you're, for example, in the consulting business, because there's so much of those protocols out there, but there are not that many people out there who really know how that stuff works. And the funny thing is, and probably people are going to blame me for saying this, but actually, if you look at Kerberos on a higher level, it has a lot of similarities with SAML, with OpenID Connect. I once was sitting down with a few colleagues a few years ago. We were in Stockholm. We had a few whiskeys, and then we talked about identity. And basically, my colleague made the statement. He was saying, OpenID Connect is just SAML. It's only using JOTs instead of it using XML. But if you look at it on a higher level, and of course there are more improvements, they're pretty much the same. So that's just a few cents from my side. If you want to learn about OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect, there are a few ways to do so. So I want to take it from there. Learning about Kerberos and NTLM could be a great topic for one of the upcoming shows, but it would be fun to have Daniel there as well, as he is kind of an expert in these type of things. So authentication. So first thing, what should I do? I want to learn about OAuth 2. Let's read the RFC. That is fun. So this is especially meant for the point that you're sitting next to the pool, you're feeling tired, you're having problems falling asleep, so you need something to help you to fall asleep. Then you can read the RFCs. Now, just kidding, to be honest, I get pretty excited about reading this stuff. So what does this mean, an RFC? So this is basically like the definition of what OAuth 2 is. Yeah, RFCs, yeah, exactly. But the funny thing is, what I learned from this RFC, and I do not recommend if you want to learn the protocol to start with this. Although this one is actually, the OAuth 2 one is pretty readable from a text perspective. But there are some funny things in there. For example, and this is what I always say to people, like when you want to build your own IDP and you want to implement OAuth 2, if you follow the standard, it says encryption is optional. So I can build an OAuth 2 according to the specs over HTTP, which you probably don't want to do. But that's a funny thing you can learn from the RFC. Also, I do love this, like the flow charts, but then in ASCII. It's really like so old school, but it does make sense to look at it and learn the flow. But if you want to learn this flow in a little bit better way and also more related to Azure AD in this case, we do have great documentation on how these flows work and how to implement them. The interesting thing, what a lot of IT pros, they have trouble finding that documentation. Why? We basically made it part of our developer documentation. So it used to be on MSDN, and now we merged it into Docs. But if you look for the Microsoft Identity Platform documentation, this is all you right away is a platform for developers, libraries, application management tools, all those type of things. But just skip over this and go into and now there you go. Go into concepts where you have the authentication basics. So it's going to talk about authentication versus authorization. And as an IT pro, this is very key information to understand. What is authentication? What is authorization? And what are examples here? And if you're going to take it back to those 4 pillars here, this will talk around what does it mean? I'm doing something with identity management. I need to do something with authentication or authorization. What does it mean? And you're probably looking at me like, I know what it is, but this is just like, I want to start to learn about identity. It also gives you some links, for example, to OpenID Connect and to the OAuth 2 website. And then it's going to apply it to how does it work within Azure AD. Because for the people who don't know, what we mean with the Microsoft Identity Platform is the Microsoft account. So that's not my internal account, but it's the account you use for Live or for Xbox. merged together with the enterprise side, which is Azure AD, into one platform. That's what we mean with the Microsoft Identity Platform. Yeah, so Bolt.io, yeah, if you want to build something yourself on the OAuth standard, Elk is none will save you headaches. Yeah, definitely. That's just, and it's funny that you say that, because the whole reason, right, why they created OAuth 2 after SAML, although OAuth 2 is authorization and not authentication, but still, is that SAML was so complex, nobody understood how it worked, or correctly understood how it worked. So the whole goal when they started with OAuth 2 was basically, let's take out all the complexity. So everything around encryption and certificates and protocols and all those type of things, that let's take that or make that optional. And then make it as focus on something that is as simple as possible. You can imagine that I showed you this. This is the core RFC for OAuth 2, where all the different flows are defined. And some flows you even don't want to use anymore today, as they have known vulnerabilities. But this is the core. There are more RFCs out there where there are additions on top of the OAuth 2 authorization framework that most of the identity providers, including Azure AD, implement from a security perspective. So going back to this documentation, so it's talking about authentication, authorization using the Microsoft platform. So it maps it to, and then you have all these videos. And this is one thing I want to point out here, is those videos, because we do have a lot of videos, which will talk about the basics of identity, but also go very, very deep into how things are working around Azure AD. So if you go to aka.ms/identity YouTube, and I already did that in this tab, then you will end up in a specific playlist within the Microsoft Security channel, where you have the Identity Architecture series, the Consumer Identity Architecture series, Identity for Developers. But you have also all kinds of things about how those things work. One video I can highly, highly recommend if you want to learn around OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, and SAML is this video by Stuart. So Stuart uses, and I'm just going to show you a bit, he uses a very, very fancy, I want to say whiteboard, but it's more a blackboard with green, and my machine is, there we go, to start to explain like how does authentication work. And it's really high level, but it applies to SAML, it applies to OpenID Connect, and he's really building it up. And we split them up in multiple videos, so multiple bytes. So you can take these videos and just between drinks, so order another cocktail, 4 minutes, 33 seconds, time for the next cocktail. Could be a great strategy if you're lying next to the pool. Although with that amount of cocktails, I'm not sure when you end up at video number 6, if you actually still understand something of what's being said. But this is really, really helpful. And even for me, so Stuart used to do these things on our internal conference. And these sessions were always fully booked. And this is also how I learned around those protocols, how they actually work. Stuart just used a whiteboard and started drawing, and yeah. So Bolt.io, no, he's not drawing backwards. I actually have seen how they do it, something with mirrors and stuff. But he's writing normally, and then they mirror it or something. By the way, if you want to mimic this in one of your videos, there's actually a tutorial on how to use PowerPoint and a green background and OBS to do the same thing without having that expensive glass board there. But this is one of them. So aka.ms, and I promise you, I will make one tweet and I will post it in the chat afterwards with the URLs I'm using today. But aka.ms/identity YouTube will bring you to this page. And what I said, this is a great one to start. If you want to learn around identity in general, so this is not specific to Azure AD. Identity in general, go look at that one. If you're like level 400 plus expert type of person, the architecture series are great. It's really like deep diving under the hood, how Azure AD is actually working. So that would be one other resource I would highly recommend watching. And then we have the other series, which are specific to a platform. Or thank you, Bolt, for posting it in the chat. So, for example, we have a whole playlist on Zero Trust. And what do you need to know? How are you going to Zero Trust type of things? Okay, going back to the documentation. So this talks about authentication versus authorization. And then you have the videos next to it. So you can you can take this documentation and then watch the videos of Stuart next to it. And it will talk about OAuth versus OpenID Connect. What's the difference? OAuth versus SAML. OpenID Connect versus SAML. So as I actually was joking that they're almost the same. Of course, there's a huge difference there. But on a high level, that's the case. But it's good to understand the differences, right? Is OAuth 2, is that an authentication protocol or authorization protocol? Because that's always like, what is it? Officially, it's authorization. And that's also where OpenID Connect kicks in. We had OAuth 2 as a great authorization platform, but we also had the need for some standardized authentication. And that is where OpenID Connect basically built an authentication layer on top of OAuth 2. But you can learn all about that in this documentation as well. Then the next important piece is those security tokens. I'm not going to deep dive in it, but I just want to point out, like, knowing the protocol, then knowing the tokens. Like, you have JSON Web Tokens and claims. If you look, for example, to Kerberos, an old protocol, they don't have tokens, but they have tickets. But those tickets also contain information, attributes, claims. It's in a different format. It's using a kind of a different flow. But as you may understand, it sounds the same. So, for example, in Kerberos, you have a TGT, which is a ticket granting ticket. And you have a TGS, which is a ticket granting service. A TGS, you can actually see that as an access token, where a TGT can be seen as a refresh token. So there's a lot of similarities between those type of protocols. So understanding the flows on a higher level, what will be done by watching that StuartCon video, is a great start, because you can apply it to all of them. And then you can decide to deep dive into one of them. So this talks about the different tokens that are there. And this is also like the different flows that are there. So if you can see in the OAuth 2 authorization framework, OAuth 2 is not one thing. There are actually multiple ways to use it, where, to be honest, most of them you probably want to avoid, but it depends on the situation. Is it server-to-server communication? Is it a client that wants to authenticate to a front end and needs tokens for a back end? Then you probably want to look into the auth code flow over here. But the auth code flow actually has a vulnerability. So we added something which is called PXE to it. And that PXE piece, for example, is another RFC on top of this. I get very, as you probably noticed, very excited talking about all of this stuff. And I read those things for fun. But I think if you're looking from a reading and learning perspective, these are the resources that can help you. So let's go back to this one, where we also have the app scenarios and the different authentication flows. So here you can learn, like, we have all those OAuth 2 different flows, what I'm just talking about. When do I need to use what with pictures? And I love pictures. I'm a visual person. Actually, this whole wall behind me is one whiteboard. And I empty it before the show to make sure there's nothing confidential on it. But I love to draw and see drawings there as well. Let me go back. So the quick start, I think that was where it was. And you can just click through. So the quick start is just how to build an app. Let me see if I can. The auth flows, app security permissioning, how to. There you see, I already lost in the documentation right now. But let me go back and then show you, because we actually have there we go. So you need to go, let me see where it is. Okay, So under authentication protocols, let me see. Yeah, so under reference. So you're here at the Microsoft Identity Platform. If you go down, all the way down, so let's close this to reference, you can see authentication protocols. And this is basically taking the RFC, which is, it's funny to see all those ASCII type of drawings in here. Where is it? There we go. ASCII type of drawing, but you probably want to have like a more clearer drawing on how that works. So here are all those type of flows. Let me just click one. And it will talk around the basics. And it's pretty high over talking about what are the players in this game. You can actually, to learn, you can actually like skip on the endpoint stuff. This is very specific to Azure AD. It's good to know, but if you want to learn about the protocol, you can skip those type of things. ASCII art in my code for future devs. Yeah, that's awesome, Bolt. I used to, so we say like Azure AD is the control plane. And I think I have the presentation somewhere. But when we started doing that, I actually made an animated ASCII plane in my PowerPoint, which I would show on the screen when talking about identity is the new control plane. I love those type of things. So you also have all those flows here. So what is the auth code grant flow that I was just talking about? So and when is it used? And then you have like, this is the ASCII, but then in a more clearer picture. And the steps, so if you compare it here, authorization grant, access token, and refresh, there's more details here. Pops up a browser dialog. So it's more understandable to learn around how does OAuth2 work and how does OpenID Connect work. So I think this is a great resource to dive into. And as you saw let me just post the link to this. The problem is the reference page. I think I can click on this one to have a link. Yeah. And you can see it's saying developer, but I think this is stuff so it's gonna, there you go. It's in the comments now, but this is stuff as an IT pro, it's so valuable to know. Because now how I know how the flows goes. So if for some reason my authentication doesn't work or there's something happening, I can figure out that during these steps, I can look into these steps, and I can figure out what is going on wrong because I know under the hood, on the base level, how this stuff works. If we go back to the 4 pillars, I think if you want to look into a learning plan and want to start learning, go have a look at this, and I'm gonna post a link to this blog post as well in the chat. If our authentication goes wrong, you can figure it out for us too. Yeah, exactly. But this blog, and this is pretty like level 100 type of things, but it is still true. And on the impact of identity, on impact on budget, and maybe some of the numbers are kind of off, but I like to structure training things around these 4 pillars and then around a few levels. So within Microsoft, we use level 100 to 400 to indicate like level 100 is marketing type of stuff, where 400 is deep dive IT pro expert. But you can also say like basic, intermediate, and advanced type of things. And this is how you can structure it. And you can say administration, these are the basic things for administration. And for authentication, these are the basic things. And that's where I just talked through, right? What are the basic things for authentication to know? If you would ask me, basic things, watch that Stuart Kwan video that I showed you, which explains how the protocols work. And then look into this summary around the authentication basics and read through those. And that will give you a great ground to work on top of. And don't think like things are not. So if you forget how one of the OAuth 2 flows is working, and you're like, man, I'm never gonna learn this. I keep on forgetting. I can tell you, I keep on forgetting about that OAuth 2 stuff as well, because it's not something I talk about on a daily basis. So when someone comes to me, a customer or a colleague, and like, let's whiteboard, I have multiple APIs and an IDP and a client, and there's a front end in between, and what type of flow should I pick, and how actually does this work, and how should I configure it? I always open up this documentation and I just refresh my mind on how do the protocols work again. And of course, on the high level, I know how it works, but those implicit grant flow, the alt flow, the on behalf of the credential grant, the device flow, the resource owner password credential grant, don't use it type of flow, I also forget about this. So it as a ground thing for authentication, this is a great place to start. If we're going to look at administration, that's more, I think, less. There's technical piece, but a big part of it is less technical. I want to know how, if someone gets to the company and on his first day, what are the steps? Probably you need to talk to HR. Probably you need to talk to others. What I learned in my 15 years of identity experience, especially around administration, is that 80% of the work is just talking to people, whiteboarding, and figuring out how does this actually goes. So I'm new, it's day one. Oh, wait, no, we need to know it minus 30 days because we need to prepare some stuff. So what are the steps? What are the things that are happening? And then you can look at the tools that can help you to automate it. And maybe there are some pieces that you don't even want to automate. I walked into a process that happens only once a year, but it took a lot of effort of custom connectors and all those type of things to build it, which was made way more expensive than just writing a manual on how to do it step by step and have an audit process in place around that, which was way cheaper. So that could be an interesting one. In general, around administration, if you look at it from a cloud world perspective, the one thing you should look into is something called SCIM. So SCIM is a standard definition on how an API should look, and that does provisioning. And this is what you also see in the what's happening now is that everyone is trying to build a SCIM endpoint to have that one-on-one connection. Where in the past, if I want to provision to a system, I actually wrote a WMI provisioning adapter because that system that I wanted to talk to only had a remote WMI interface. Terrible. And it will take a lot of work to build it. If it would have a SCIM interface, I know how the connection works, so I can just use that. Again, part of our developer documentation, you don't have to read the developer piece, but just read the first piece. How does the protocol actually work? It has standard endpoints. It has well-known endpoints. So there's an endpoint users, groups, users, and how does it map the attributes? This can really help you in understanding in like, I do provisioning to Workday or do provisioning to another system and something goes wrong. What's happening there? And also when someone comes to you and they're like, we want to use this new app. And the first thing, of course, you need to ask is, does it support anything like federation? Preferably OpenID Connect. If it does SAML, okay, if you really want to have that application. But from a provisioning perspective, I think we should set the same standard and baseline. It should support SCIM. And more applications are supporting SCIM. And also, I just talked about our new on-premises connector, which is basically a translation engine talking SCIM at one end and talking SQL at the other end and makes that translation. Again, if you're a big fan of reading RFCs, they're also there for SCIM. I actually read those as well. This goes into a lot of detail. I wouldn't recommend if you just start like looking into identity or looking into SCIM. Just go to this page. I'm just going to paste it in the chat window as well. Have a look at this documentation. And what I said, just go to the first part. Look at the steps. Look how you need to design it. And this is important to understand. Now it goes already into a little bit of detail. I think it's good to understand the language, how it looks. But then later on, we were talking about developing a sample schema. Yeah. If you're into developing, yeah, go ahead. But if you're more like, I want to know it from an IT pro perspective, just read this piece. Try to understand it, and try to set up a skim provisioning with an app that you maybe already have, or a sample app that you want to use, to just understand how that is working. Okay, so just a few guidelines on administration and authentication, what to look into. If you look at authorization and auditing, we do also have a lot of videos which talks around those processes. And what I said, this is just an example of 4 pillars. Nowadays, a lot of times when we're talking about identity governance, we're talking about administration and auditing, and probably also some authorization. So there can be an overlap between those 4 pillars. But in general, I still believe that when you're talking about identity and access management and you want to hit every piece of it, you need to talk about all of those 4 things. That can overlap, doesn't have to stand on their self, but it's very important. Okay, that was it for this week. What I said, a quick version, but I just wanted to share some stuff to read, some stuff to think about, some videos to watch when you're hopefully gonna enjoy some time off. If not, this is also very nice during a coffee break, or during the summer. Probably not a lot is happening. So yeah, have a look. I definitely planning on doing a second version on this one as well. Then we can dive a little bit more into authorization and auditing and some resources there. So yeah, so I hope this was useful, and looking at the chat, very detailed, awesome info. Thank you so much. We have our Discord server, aka.ms/4to5show Discord/join, but it is also in the IM. Thanks, Bolt, for putting it there, where you can chat with us, leave questions. I will make sure to post the stuff I'm talked about today in the Discord as well, so we also can have a discussion. And I'm really happy. I'm really looking forward to learn from you. What do you use to learn? Do you have specific resources that are out there that I'm not aware of? Because especially in IT, it's always a learning journey. But I hope this will help you a bit starting with that journey. Okay, so before I'm gonna close the stream, it's time to rate a channel. So I'm just gonna press the rate channel button. And I see, so I use a Pluralsight, MS Learn, and a few others. Those are also great resources. If you have access to Pluralsight, I also had some sessions I watched on there. Another one, which I think is not that known, is LinkedIn Learning. Not sure if it's public, but I watched some very cool videos on LinkedIn Learning as well. Not that it's a Microsoft company, but I did have access to it. So those are all great resources too. Cool. Okay, so we can choose between L. Swigert or RWX Rob to rate. So which one should we pick? L. Swigert or RWX Rob? I'm just gonna pick RWX Rocks. Start rate because he has less viewers. And then MS Mechanics is also a great place. And I think this is funny. It's before I'm gonna press the rate now button. One interesting thing to share with you is that we have so many, as in we Microsoft have so many places where we put readiness stuff that we even ourselves, we don't know where stuff is anymore. And there's a lot of stuff on different. Every year we decide that now it probably is a better place to put it on a different platform. So we create Excel sheets for people who start at the company with all those type of identity resources. And actually some of the things I shared with you today are on that list. So if you would onboard into Microsoft in an identity related role, the things I shared with you today are things that we would recommend you to read and to look into. Okay, so thank you all for watching this week. Hope to see you next week again, Wednesday at 8 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. CET, and 4 p.m. GMT. Wow, there goes my time zones. And probably going to pick another cool topic next week. So I will thank you for watching this week. And we're now going to rate RWX Rob. Have a great week. Talk to you later.